Government stance in today's debate is that social movements should prioritize local activism since we are better able to effectively create societal change and also adopt to the environment better, catering to a greater number of people and thus making the societal movement overall much more effective, strategic, and able to effectively make societal change. Now, before we go on to our two arguments, first of all, on framing and model. So what does local activism actually look like? This local activism looks like organizing their communities around specific issues such as rising estates, allowing gay rights, and etc. This also looks like collaborating with local police officers, local politicians, and local people who live in these areas, and etc., in order to actually create that societal change. And this local activism is not only limited to neighborhoods, but it also includes cities or specific areas where there is a sense of community and a bonding of interests and cultures. This is in contrast to national activism, where the societal movement will strive for national change by trying to work with the country's government, country's politician, and etc. And we do think that in the case of national activism, these groups will be much more bigger with a diverse demographic of people of like similar interests or similar goals, trying to actually make striving to make change in the country's government and in through using like social media or etc. But now going on to our first argument about how we are the side who is able to make immediate tangible impacts and change, and how that is ultimately the prerequisite to making effective change in the long term and in a broader scale. This is based on the premise that it is easier to demand smaller changes within local communities and garner their support first as a leverage in order to expand their influence to the greater society. Why is this premise true? Local communities are just in number compared to national levels. That is to say, when convincing these people, it is much easier to convince smaller groups of people at once to gain support for the movement rather than attempting to gain the attention of everyone in the country. On the opposition side, there will inevitably be large groups of people who just do not want to listen to social movements on a national level and are simply just really conservative, will not be convinced or changed at all. This is just really difficult to do. There's a reason why the US right now is struggling to get structural change for things like abortion, because so many people do not want to have that. But then we think that this is also partly because often social movements in the status quo are unable to actually gain attention or social change because people simply don't care about them. People don't actually understand the struggles of these people because they seem too distant and etc. This is especially true because people these days are extremely desensitized to media and advertisements that they see in the internet, especially since they get exposed to these things literally everywhere. The problem with this is that these people are unable to actually empathize with the social movement and do anything constructive to contribute to the movement, especially since this is happening at a very national level. These movements can't like cater to these individual beings, individual people who live in that nation, right? So we think that that is the inherent disadvantage that these societal movements will face under opposition side. But then under a comparative, people are able to get that quick immediate change because it's easier to understand what local communities want, especially since this is happening in that local community. People are able to know and understand what are the specific incentives of the people and what their ideologies are, right? So we think that this is able, and especially by collaborating with local polices, local communities, they're able to get direct accessibility and direct intercourse with these resources and with these people who are actually able to make change in society, while under opposition side, there's so much higher barrier in actually achieving and gaining access to all these resources that's actually able to create in that national change, especially since social movements are created by minority groups, and it's unable to and it's unlikely how they're actually going to appeal to like the national government or national politicians. But then on Wayne, we think that first of all, this is the prerequisite to actual greater societal change, because greater local support means that more people overall there will be more people overall who care about this movement. And this also means that there will be more areas which actually care and which actually directly interact or directly empathize with this movement. So we think that this will result in more political relevancy, politicians who want to make national change. And we think that OO's benefit of national change as well And we take OO's benefit of national change as well because local activism makes national change easier. And we think that this is especially true because since if we start in a local community and actually able to make effective change within that local community, they have that more leverage and they have that more platform to actually gain more attention of that national government, especially since if these local politicians have connections or these local politicians have that actual power to make these voice or make these changes in the national government, we think that that strategy is better than in the opposition side where they're just starting in the national level with like no power or no support at all with. And we think that that is a very strategic way for these social movements to actually gain leverage and gain power. But then we think that secondly, on urgency, these are local communities that need immediate change and need to fix these very urgent problems that exist in the status quo. This looks like racial minorities facing discrimination and hate crimes that need change right now. We think that time and short-term immediate response is something that is very, very important. So we think that especially considering the urgency and how quickly these problems should be resolved, we are the one who are better able to cater to the incentives and actually able to make that structural change, while under their side they're unable to actually gain that leverage or get the resources to actually create that change. But on our second argument about how we are able to be more flexible and adaptive depending on the environment, this is based on the premise that the social movement is able to gain much more leverage and support by specifically catering to the incentives of the people around them. Because we think that another big problem with social movements is that they're very slow in adopting to changes, especially since the public's incentives, needs, and priorities change constantly. It is very difficult for these activists and large movements to actually adopt and reflect these changes. This is especially true since the bigger the movement is, the more conflicting interests and the more different incentives there are within the movement. So even if they're united for a single goal or single incentive, that does not mean that they have the same interest in how they achieve this goal or how they actually want this to happen. So especially in the changing values of society, it is very, very unlikely how they are able to effectively and efficiently solve these problems, given that these societal values change constantly and the interests within the movement change constantly, and because of all of these conflicting interests, we in the comparative we are much better able to achieve this because depending on the people's interests and their priorities, they can quickly adopt their strategies and their stance. For all these reasons, we are very proud to propose.
So in my speech, I'll be first giving a quick clarification, and then I'll be moving on to responding to PM, and then I'll be moving on to introducing our team's arguments. First is on addressing systemic issues, and second is on effectiveness. So first, a quick clarification, right? So the motion specifically states that social movements should prioritize local activism as opposed to national activism, right? We think that the word prioritize means that we do both of these things. However, we prioritize one over another. This does not mean that we do not have any local activism, but rather we should prioritize national activism, as this can lead to more systematic change, right? So what this means is that this already basically like turns most of their arguments, as we can still help the local community in the short term and then divert even more resources to help in the long term to advocate for even more change, right? But even if you don't buy this, let's move on to like refuting their arguments, right? So first they talk about immediate change. First of all, just because you focus on local activism does not mean that people will necessarily support it, right? Their own example on abortion, just because you encourage them and you like make the regulations more like specific and local, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will like support the local community, right? We don't think anything changes. Their incentive probably won't change just because it's in a like smaller regulation, and we think that this impact is simply symmetrical on both sides. But secondly, we think that even if you don't buy this, we tell you that the long-term impacts outweigh the short-term, right? First, it's because this outweighs on scope. We benefit more people if you advocate for bigger change. But secondly, we think that this solves the root problems, right? For example, their own example on climate change, we can only solve climate change if you address the root problems, if you make everybody want to change, right? You can't necessarily solve climate change if only a few local communities are changing and the broader society isn't doing so, right? So we think that these main problems can only be solved if you address these root problems. But then they talk about like flexibility, right? We think that immediate local changes can sometimes be like reversible by governments, particularly because it does not align with the broader national policies or cultural norms, right? We think that national activism, although it might just take a little bit longer to gain the support from the community, it is focused on more like long term and is it is actually like it's like much more difficult to undo and has a much wider impact, because on their side, even if they're more flexible, which we don't think is true, because people might not support it, but secondly, we think that it's not that flexible because it could be easily undone by the government if they did not support it, right? So our first argument is on addressing systematic issues, right? We tell you that national activism is crucial because it has the power to address systemic issues that transcend local boundaries. Two layers of analysis. First is that federal court rulings always comes before local activism, right? This means that even if you address small problems in the local areas, they're still going to be overwritten by the ruling, not now, and could be easily reversed by the government if they do not agree with it, since local activism does not have to take place with the government's consent, right? But secondly, we tell you that many of the most pressing social problems such as climate change, racial inequality, and economic disparity are not directed to a single community, right? We think that these issues, they deeply rely on the national policies and the national institutions and cultural norms. Thus, these require national solutions and can only be solved if we take a more broader way to solvency. So an example, right? For example, is the civil rights movement in the United States, where there were many important local efforts. The movement's success depended on the national activism that led to the landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act, right? And then the impact of this, there's two impacts. First of all, we tell you that by focusing on national activism, these social movements, they can achieve a systemic change that can benefit all citizens, right? That ensures that progress is not limited to a few localized areas, but extends across the entire nation. We think that this ensures that everybody benefits rather than just some people, which is we think this is very important because a country's resources are limited and they're not able to support every single local community, right? It is better to divert these resources towards helping the entire country instead of focusing it on some places, because the resources are limited and we can only make that much change if we ensuring that it's more on the broader community can lead to even bigger change. But secondly, we think that this addresses the root problems, as for example, climate change. If only some places are regulated, it doesn't necessarily work. You have to have a broader change if you want to address root problems. But before I continue, what's a POI?
So how are you actually going to make change nationally, given that you don't have the resources or any power to actually go up to the national government?
Right. So, like I've already clarified, right, on both sides, we're going to have local activism and national activism. We just think that we should prioritize national activism, because if you don't prioritize this, then you can't necessarily solve root problems. You can't necessarily make systemic change, right? So even though we're going to do both of these things, we think that we should still prioritize this as at least a bigger change. But moving on to our second argument on effectiveness, two layers of analysis. First, on unified and cohesive messaging, right? We think that national activism allows for more unified and cohesive movement. When activists work together on a national scale, they're more likely to create powerful message, which is crucial for influencing the public opinion, media coverage, and government policy, right? We think that local activism, while it can be important to some extent, it can sometimes result in efforts that lack the same level of impact, right? But second is the mobilization of resources and support. We think that national movements, they have access to broader base of resources, including more funding, more media coverage, and more public support, right? We think that these resources, they're crucial for sustaining long-term activism and achieving significant change, right? We think that things such as local movements, on the other hand, they might struggle with limited resources. For example, they don't have that much resources as the government, making it harder to sustain their efforts over time, right? We think that the impact of this is that, first of all, a unified national movement can be more effectively mobilize resources, and it can attract more media attention, right, and gain more political support, making it easier to achieve significant changes. For example, places like climate change, you need support, you need the government support and the government's resources in order to do so. You can't necessarily solve climate change or decrease climate change if you're just relying on the community, and if the entire country is not trying to advocate for change, you won't necessarily have change at all, right? But secondly, we tell you that this can lead to more long-term changes, right? For example, like I've said, things like climate change. If you want to solve the root problem of climate change, you can't rely on local communities, right? You can't just tell this one community to stop using plastics or to stop emitting pollution into the air. It doesn't necessarily work, right? You have to have these unified regulations. You have to have the whole community try to advocate for this change in order for it to happen, right? I would think that this is actually also just much faster, because if you implement one policy that affects the entire country, it's going to be much more faster than implementing small policies for every single other local community. So yeah, this is also just much more efficient and can achieve better impacts. So for all these reasons, I'm proud to stand on opening opposition. Thank you.
It was through grassroots activism and movements that we were able to get the structural change that we see today. It was through local activism in San Francisco that resulted in national change for gay rights. And it was through women in different communities fighting for local change that eventually led to suffragette laws. Before anything, a few direct responses. First of all, why will we get more support? And this is because mainly proximity bias. It's much easier for you to garner support from people when they are the very people who are close to you and you see the people who that you care about are affected by these issues. That is to say that when it's in a smaller community, you understand these people, you often might have emotional connections to them. They might be the people that you see every day at your grocery store or people who are at your workplace and they're your co-workers. That is to say, when you hear that these people are the very people affected by social movements and these discriminations, you're more likely to care and you're more likely to be pushed to the threshold in which you want to make change and support the movement. But also it's easier to be flexible depending on communities. And there was no response from this. We tell you that within different communities, they have different incentives. So when we're focusing on local activism, it's much easier to change your strategy depending on separate communities. For example, if it's a much more conservative community, you might want to be pushing for a little less change. Like you don't want to be completely going in a radical liberal stance. You might want to try to garner their support first. But when it's a more liberal community, you can get greater benefits and get greater, faster change by supporting more radical stances. That kind of flexibility for easier and faster change does not happen under their world. But secondly, OO cannot just co-opt all our benefits by saying that you will just focus on local activism as well and you'll focus on both. That just worsens their case, and it's a really soft, wishy-washy stance. When you spread out efforts on both sides, then the quality of both strategies just diminishes because there are limited resources and capital that the social movements have. That is to say, if their model is true, that you're spreading out resources on both local and national activism, then the quality of both are just going to go down because you don't have money to support both at the same time. But thirdly, OO's case was contingent on the assumption that national activism means national change, because if we really look at their case, it was just full of assertions. If their characterization that these problems in society are so deeply rooted and difficult to solve is true, then it's going to be difficult to convince an entire population of like millions of people to agree when it's such a deeply rooted social norm. That is to say that there's always going to be conservative people who will not listen to these social movements under their world when you're trying to convince them first. They will either make minimal change by having a soft stance to garner conservative support, which is not even guaranteed, or which means that they just don't help minorities or have a strong stance. So you just don't do that, or you just have a strong stance as a movement that doesn't garner support of like 50% of the population who are conservative. So at the end of the day, they just don't get any change, and it's really hard to have a clear stance. But also, it's just really hard to convince like Utah, Texas, and Florida to care about racism because there's like a lot of racist people out there who just don't care. But fourthly, how does our world on the flip side get fast change? Because it's about people in marginalized communities facing urgent issues. That is to say, when people see these urgent issues, you need to act fast. So if people are getting, police brutality in certain communities, we have local movements actually act fast, protest for that structural change as soon as possible, fixing the holes in these certain communities where the harm is worse and more people are being faced by these problems. But also, these are often nuanced intersectional issues that are different for each community. That is to say, different communities face different levels of discrimination. So under our world, it's easier to address these different levels of discrimination in different communities in easier ways. But also, they talk about long-term. So why should this be prioritized? The premise here is that national governments are able to more effectively create change, but they're literally arguing on their best case scenario. So sure, national governments are able to have more effective change. They have the capacity, but the reason why this motion exists in the first place is right now is it's so hard for these minority social movements to access these things in the first place. Often these minorities are people who do not have higher levels of education because they're more like discriminated and have structural disadvantages. That is to say, it's harder to access these law change when less people have the ability to do so. But also, even if governments are capable, all they proved is that they're capable in making changes, but they never proved why the governments want to make these changes. We tell you that they don't have any incentive when nobody cares in the first place. But also, what is the win condition of this debate? The end goal of this debate is, as a social movement, it's not to simply gain more relevancy or gain more support. The end goal of any social movement is instead to eventually better the lives of the very minorities they want to support and uplift them from their shackles of suffering. That is to say that if it is only OG who actually proves to you how we directly better achieve uplifting minorities, catering to the lives of minorities, and how we prevent any further suffering. That is the priority we must focus on, because social movements need to care for their minorities. That's literally their purpose. But also, We tell you that urgency and time is at the essence here because it's literally the very problems that people are facing right now as we speak. That is to say that there are certain communities that are oppressing their minorities much more, and we need to address those faster instead of spending like years to get one law to pass. But before anything, a few substantives and rebuilding. First of all, on the quality of supporters. Note here that under our world, supporters are more likely to participate in protests because they are more closely related to the movement and tied to it. For example, community pressures apply more when the people when the people see who you are and you're not hiding under an anonymous mask. That is to say, when you're in a smaller community and more people are trying to support the movement, you're pressured to do this more because people know who you are and it's going to affect your image greater. That is to say that there's greater pressure to change when it is local. But secondly, we tell you that local activism is the prerequisite to getting national change in the first place, because politicians are only incentivized to make policy change when, certain local areas, when certain cities, when certain states actually care about the issue in the first place. The problem with their world is it's much harder to convince more people to vote for these policy changes on a national level when just these smaller groups which build up these bigger communities do not want that kind of change because they don't care at all. So now let me move on to my extension on how we better the quality of life for minorities within each area. So first layer, how we shift social norms and cultures. It's much easier to shift existing niche social norms in different communities when we're able to have that kind of change. That is to say that when we're directly addressing the different, norms and cultures within these communities, we change the existing norm. Like more people want to do these things within these communities. Like for example, if we have a lot of protests for like gay rights within a certain community, the kind of norm within the community becomes greater solidarity. That's why San Francisco is able to have that kind of progressive change. But secondly, on the quality of policies, we tell you that the quality of policies are greater under our side of the house when we have direct engagement with minorities within the communities to the policies that they're making. It's much easier for minorities to, engage with the policies that they're creating and the change that they're creating when it's local, because now you're kind of seen as someone who's important in the movement and you're able to make that level of change. Otherwise, under their world, it's much harder to change laws as a minority when you do not have that kind of access to education and higher level laws in the first place. But also, finally, we tell you that minorities care about immediate change and immediate alleviation from their struggles. So the ultimate goal of any social movement is to alleviate them from the current struggles as soon as possible, not to wait 2 years for any laws to be passed. So proud to oppose.
Go. First of all, I would like to clarify some things, right? They tell you we already have a significant amount of big corporations and you can just pitch your ideas into them. However, notice that this is a regrets motion. The government has the burden to defend a world where the startup culture never existed and not analyze how we can abolish startup culture with the status quo resources, right? Notice how there are examples such as Netflix and SpaceX are companies that only started influenced by startup culture that took up huge risks when they were starting, right? But moving on, they tell us that they're still going to have the business that we have today because they can have government funding and billionaires can still have businesses. However, first of all, we tell you that the businesses that are able to get government funding are only the few. It is highly unlikely that governments will heavily fund startups for non-necessities like Netflix or SpaceX, especially when they already have government institutions like NASA, right? We tell us that billionaires also are not affected by startup culture, so they can still have billionaires that are pitching for like better businesses, right? They tell their logic is that the info side says that people work for little pay. That's why billionaires are not included. We don't think that's true. The info side says that people are working for the business that are working with little pay, not the business owner. This means that companies that were billionaires but had people that are working for low pay for them to start up their company still exists and still is included in startup culture, as long as they were taking risk when they were starting up, instead of, for example, government funded, instead of, for example, it's a family business, etc. But furthermore, on their mitigation of other sources of innovation, such as starting a company with passion and not monetary benefits. We think this is really untrue and is non-unique on their side because nowhere in the info side says that startup culture only cares about monetary benefits, right? On the contrary, we tell you that many businesses created under the influence of startup culture was actually not based on monetary incentives, but rather personal passions, such as a mission to solve social environmental problems, right? We think these incentives, such as personal passions, also can exist on our side. This is literally non-unique. But furthermore, onto their arguments then. First of all, they tell us that startup culture encourages people to lose everything because they bet all their money on their businesses and they have no way of succeeding. So the premise of their argument is that people are very highly unlikely to succeed. Like only 1 in 100 people succeed startups, right? First of all, this is just an assertion. They never proved to us. However, we also tell you that there is also, even though there is a significantly high risk, it is still a viable option. Two reasons why. First of all, we think startup culture encourages taking reasonable risks. It's not reckless risk taking where everyone believes they're Bill Gates, everyone believes they're Steve Jobs, right? We think that the belief or the expectation that people take when they want to have a startup is that they want their business to grow, but they don't expect them to be like world leading businesses like Steve, like Apple or like SpaceX, right? Because they know that their personal capacity may not be as much as, for example, Elon Musk, who is a billionaire. We think that there are people governments that can't just assume that people are stupid. People still have a reasonable knowledge of their capacities. Startup culture only encourages them to put resources in so that they can have an expectation that their business will grow to some extent. But furthermore, we think people are unlikely to invest all their money into a startup if they don't have the capacity to do so, right? Because if you look at your bank account, you only have $1 million, you're probably not going to have a startup. But furthermore, we think that successful entrepreneurs are often those who are manage risk effectively, right? They make calculated decisions based on, like, for example, the market state right now, or like customer feedback, and they make financial plannings. I don't think people are as ignorant as government frames them to be. But second of all, I think startups often come with strong support in the first place, such as incubators and accelerators that are programs that are designed to help startups grow by providing them with resources. This means that the risk isn't just put on this one business owner where they lose everything or they're very likely to lose everything. We don't think that's the case. So first, we tell you that the prominence of the startup culture, the prevalence of it, how many people recognize that there is a startup culture and how many people go to start up businesses means that there's more awareness that in turn, this has led to facilities that you can see now, like co-working spaces or collaboration opportunities or like startup hubs, etc., where many people collaborate together to start up a business. We think this, first of all, this shares the risk between different people. And we think the risks are minimized when you have these facilities because of the prominence of startup culture. On the second argument then, on how startup culture leads people to overwork themselves. Oh yeah, I'll take your POI.
You talked about how our startups failing was an assertion, but our second speaker literally talked about how poor people are the most likely to start up businesses. And the first speaker already talked about how people often have to finance out of their own pockets to start a business, leaving them in a very financially precarious situation.
Okay, first of all, on the poor people situation, I think it's also often the case that poor people also are likely to start with stable businesses, such as family businesses, right? You see a lot of people in developing countries that are running their family businesses. They don't believe that they can become Steve Jobs. They don't believe that they can become Elon Musk, but they do have a projection that they can, for example, sustain a family business. I think they still have reasonably risk management. But furthermore, I think the things that you're talking about, where they're literally on the brinks of death and they have to take a bet, in those cases, I think it's reasonable for them to have a startup. They'll have it even without startup culture because they're desperate. If they don't do it, if they don't have a chance, take a chance for money, then they don't. But furthermore, on the idea of how startup culture leads people to overwork themselves. First of all, I think overworking exists on both worlds. In any entrepreneurship, people are just pushed to work hard, even for your family businesses, etc. They're also working hard. Capitalism still exists. You still have competition. The pressure to expand your business and earn more money still exists. And we also think when any business start up, people still work super hard. This is really non-unique. Even if you're a very poor person in a poor country, you still want to earn more money. You still have this incentive to overwork yourself. I think this is very symmetrical. But furthermore, I think they dropped our argument on how we have more flexibility and adaptability when you have a diverse range of companies, right? We tell you that we can't only look from the micro level. We also have to look from a macro level where you get a lot of diversity of companies. You get a lot of diversity of services so that you can have more adaptability during periods like COVID, for example, right? During the COVID pandemic, many startups were able to adjust their business models quickly to meet new demands compared to these big corporations that were already established. And you also need multiple diverse services in these situations. And we think that is better to have more diverse services for the whole society on a macro level. So for these reasons above, strong to stand on opening opposition.
Side opposition is living in a fantasy world where they think we can jump straight to national level movements without first prioritizing the creation of a stronghold of local movements. As member of government, this House believes that social movements should prioritize local activism as opposed to national activism. And first, I'll start with some rebuttals. Local activism always comes first. They are the spark that creates the fire that is national movements. There is a problem of dependency here. Local activism can exist without national activism, and yet national activism cannot exist without local activism. Side opposition has also talked about gaining more media attention, but are national movements gaining positive or negative media attention? National activism is more likely to garner negative media attention, while local activism is more likely to garner positive media attention, and I will expand on this later. Opposition has also said that local movements are easier to cut down using majority groups, such as conservatives being dominant. But how are you supposed to have a national movement if you don't even have the ability to make a local one? So obviously, local movements are the step one to this, and they should be prioritized. And they have also said that social media platforms can pull resources from all over the country, and that is a benefit that can exist on both sides. Precisely because of the introduction of social media, we now don't need national movements to be prioritized that have harms like negative media attention. So in this debate, we have seen four key stakeholders: the vulnerable actor, the media, the government, or the policymakers whose policy we are trying to change, and for your average Joe, society. So my first extension point is that it is hard to handle change. Change is a transforming force in society and is always present. Change has phases and requires time. And change is hard because we're forced to do something differently, something we're not used to. And because so many people have inherent biases, social change efforts are often hampered by humans' strong subconscious motivation to defend and justify the status quo, including existing social, economic, and political institutions and arrangements. Second extension point: small groups can create just as much impact with easier organization. When looking over the course of human history, we tend to focus on times of disruption, where the established order is crumbling and something new is rising. But if we take a step back, something different strikes us. The vast majority of human history is characterized by small groups of people, wielding often brutal power over massive numbers of others without substantial resistance. Most of the time, the masses accept subjugation at the hands of a small cabal that they could almost definitely overwhelm if properly organized. So we see here that local movements can actually create just as much impact as national movements, and we have seen this through history. For example, Black Lives Matter, Vietnam War protests. All of these have happened in smaller constituencies like college campuses, and yet have created a large impact. Thirdly, the government. The government has an incentive to shoot down movements that they don't agree with. And national movements are actually counterintuitively easier to shoot down because there are only one enemy. Meanwhile, local movements are the underdogs. So the government has a moral responsibility, it has a paternalistic role of the state not to shoot them down because society likes underdogs and they'll have something to say about it. And meanwhile, there are so many local movements that the government will have a hard time trying to justify their policies. So this means that having many, many local movements are much harder to justify, to shoot down, in comparison to having one big national movement. We need a strong series of strong local movements before going national, or else opposing groups will just go feral immediately. Fourthly, media and society. So media encompasses TV, radio, newspapers, social media, etc. The media shapes the way that individuals view the world. It influences perspectives on social, political, and economic issues. So therefore, within its extensive reach, the media bears a responsibility to disseminate accurate, unbiased, and ethical information. However, unfortunately, that is not the case. The media does have biases, and we need to use that to an advantage. But first off, let's explain why the media is such an important stakeholder that no other side has analyzed in depth yet. So you see, we did not just fall out of a coconut tree, to quote Kamala Harris. We live in the context of all in which we live and all that came before us. And she has a point. Recently, social media usage has risen to the top because it gives voices to marginalized communities, even small local movements, and has been historically underrepresented or silenced in mainstream media. And activists can use these platforms to share their stories, perspectives, and demands directly with a very large audience, which will help local movements to get attention and get resources in order to run their movements, despite being a small local movement. And social media is so important and so powerful because it can twist a social narrative. There are all sorts of things out there like echo chambers in social media that can amplify certain perspectives or voices while silencing others. And it can manipulate facts, shaping public opinion based on biased or incomplete information. So when social media is so powerful, we must use that to our advantage. So how does this relate to our motion? Well, when we have local movements, they become an underdog, and people love underdogs. The psychological reason why is because we can empathize with them and identify with their struggles. We all face challenges in life, and when we see someone else overcoming adversity, it gives us hope that we can do the same. In addition, unexpected successes always make for more fun news stories and are more touching. So when having an underdog, which is a local movement, because local movements are underdogs, they can tap into the fundamental human emotions and values, which will make society like them. And the media, just like any other business out there, they want more views, more money, which means that they will want to cater to what society likes to see. So if society likes underdogs, the media will show more about underdogs, making them a staple in the media across various formats. So when local activism is prioritized, what will happen is that the media will be more likely, much more likely than national movements, to depict it in a flattering way. The media will cater to whatever society likes. And the impact is that the media can broadcast to everyone across the nation, across the globe. So having the media on our side is so important and can create a ripple effect. So in conclusion, local activism cannot exist without national activism, and yet national activism cannot exist without local activism. Thank you.
Judge, when it comes to social change, we need to think big to make a real impact. Prioritizing national activism isn't just about scaling up efforts, it's about addressing systemic issues that local movements alone cannot tackle. By uniting diverse groups on a national level, we are able to create the momentum and resources that are necessary for change that reaches the most communities that we can. I'd first like to make one major clarification. Government claims that their side, local activism, is a prerequisite for national activism and opposition's case impacts. We flip this argument. We think that rather, national activism should be put first to be able to help local communities and towns. This is because local governments often lack the resources and support needed to drive substantial change on their own. They can be frail and underfunded, which limits their capacity to address issues effectively. By prioritizing national activism, we ensure that these local efforts receive the necessary backing and structure to be impactful, as national movements can provide the support and systemic changes that reinforce local initiatives. Now onto our setup. What does national activism actually look like? We address issues on a countrywide scale, influencing national policy, creating more widespread awareness, and pushing for broader change across the nation. On Our World, with national movements, we bring together a wide range of groups, organizations, and individuals from different
Point of
parts
information.
of the country. Chat POIs, please. This is a unique benefit on our side, which allows for a more unified and powerful push for change. We are able to combine the strengths and diverse resources of diverse stakeholders. But also, national activism is focused on long-term and more sustainable goals rather than short-term immediate fixes. We aim to create better change that will continue to benefit future generations. We achieve this by addressing the underlying issues and systemic issues that contribute to societal problems. Some examples of national activism include the civil rights movement in the US, which addressed racial discrimination and segregation across the country. They were able to make a substantial impact and make changes in national laws and policies. So we think we better address legislative changes, regulations, and other reforms. Now, how does our side allow for broader change? While local activism is very important for addressing immediate and specific needs of a community, national activism is what allows us to create systemic change that affects all communities. In a world where challenges like climate change occurring from systemic issues and economic inequality cross regional boundaries, we say national activism is absolutely necessary to unify all the efforts of social movements. If not, they become useless. Now, Why does a larger and bigger scale matter? This is because it is the only method to achieve systemic impact because systemic reforms are facilitated at the national level. Second, we have a larger, more unified movement that can exert more influence together. And third, we allow for long-term change. Now, what are the goals of the social movements that we want to clarify? First, getting attention from the public. Second, legislative and policy change. And third, achieving broader social justice. Before I move on to my rebuttals, I'd like to address the burdens of proofs in this debate. So we as opposition have the burden to prove that national activism is necessary and most important and powerful for creating systemic change that benefits all communities. We want to make a more lasting impact on legislation, and we will also tell you why national activism can unify diverse groups and amplify their voices as a whole. For government side to win this debate at this point, they have to prove how local activism can extend to bigger communities and make broader impacts, how local activism leads to stronger community engagement comparatively, and they also have to explain why addressing the specific needs of small communities should be prioritized. Now the rebuttals against OG. They firstly state that people simply don't care about and don't understand the struggles in the status quo. They don't empathize with the movement. The PM claims that the reason for this is because of the scale of the movement. We don't think people ignore social campaigns just because they are at a national level. Disinterest often stems from broader issues like lack of personal connection, as Nabin talks about, not the scale of the campaign. Local activism does not inherently resolve this issue, as individuals still need to feel personally connected to the cause. Even if what the PM talks about is true, a larger scale still exerts greater pressure on policymakers, which is more beneficial. In addition, we say national activism brings significant advantages in terms of credibility and impact. For example, the global response to climate change was deeply influenced by national movements like the Paris Agreement, which uniquely allows for widespread attention and resources. Secondly, they claim that local communities need urgent change with examples like hate crimes. While addressing urgent local issues like hate crimes are important, our approach balances this with the benefits of national activism. The trade-off here is that while national activism may not immediately address every local crisis, it drives better systemic change that ultimately supports local efforts as well. By influencing national policies and raising widespread awareness, we can secure funding, establish strong regulations, and create long-term solutions that benefit all communities. Even if the regulations are less good and powerful than local communities, local social movements, we are able to make the situation better in more communities in a more cost-effective way. Lastly, on their point on better flexibility, we think local activism will struggle to do so due to the limited influence of smaller or weaker local governments. This slows down the progress, and the local authorities lack the power or resources to effect meaningful change. However, national activism operates at a level where there are stronger and centralized governments. Now to OO's case, they say that national activism may take longer, but it addresses long-term issues. Here, let me extend on this point by talking about the long-term issues that should be the biggest interest in this debate. National activism may take longer, but it tackles systemic and long-term issues that are necessary for sustainable progress. The long-term impact is most crucial because it addresses the root causes and creates lasting reforms for society. OO also claims that they will try to work both at a national and local level more comprehensively. However, we say that we are able to impact both levels without trying to divert funds in a messy way. Although the influences on the local level may be less significant, we already made a trade-off on this. We say the broader scope of national activism is crucial because it addresses systemic issues that affect multiple local communities simultaneously. And therefore, we win this debate. So proud to oppose.
The assumption from the opposition side that change is easy and will happen once you put in the effort scares me. Change needs to happen in baby steps, and slowly and surely it would happen. When you blast your message nationwide and expect things to change, it would not, right? I would be with my speech. In my speech, I would be summarizing this debate with a house-by-house analysis, and by the end of my speech, I would have proved why closing government has clearly won this debate. So, before I begin with everything, one of the biggest clashes in this debate is what sort of activism can actually help the vulnerable, right? Opposition believes that there isn't going to be many opposition change that can happen. However, we would like to address this opposition, that exists locally, will exist no matter what. It is just how which side tackles it better, right? On government side, the local activism is taking it bite size by bite. So you need to tackle all these oppositions for change to happen. Opposition is just tucking all the people opposing change under the bed and acting like everything is sunshine and rainbows, when closing government chooses to bite the bullet and try to tackle the problem that people are trying to oppose locally so national policies can happen, right? So first of all, I'll be starting with the opposition side. So what do we see on opening opposition? We see that they gave us the point how people locally, they won't support it. However, we believe it is easier to convince because it is a smaller community than nationwide. When you successfully convince a smaller group of people, this causes a ripple effect as other activist groups can see the spark in local change works. Step by step, change can happen. However, when you choose to loudly announce your ideas nationwide, the backlash will be larger and harder to address, right? Both opposition side also provided an example on, for example, civil rights. We turned this example on how it benefits government bench instead, because, for example, what happened was the Montgomery bus boycott, sparked by Rosa Parks rejecting to give up her seat. They boycotted the bus system in their town for a whole year. It caused a detrimental economic effect. The government had to end the segregation laws for public transportation. This all happened in one city itself, but caused a large nationwide turn for African Americans, and it is one baby step happening in one town. However, it caused ripples because other activists realized that local activism works, right? So therefore, their examples on civil rights does not benefit their side, but it strongly benefits local activism as a whole. They also talked about how there's no need for prioritization for policies because they will be passed anyways because it is local, so the majority doesn't believe. That's why priority should be placed in locally, because so what, it's nationwide. They are comfortably living in their own town because their neighbors don't have a problem with the change. So what would really affect people is when your, for example, local coffee shop owner feels that there's a change will be needed because you actually spend time or see these people in your town every day. You feel more empathy towards them and actually see them as humans. So what do we see on also closing opposition, right? They talked about how you have to think big to make actual impacts, and it is the only method to create societal change, and how local governments are lack resources and are frail or underfunded and can't actually address problems. We already mentioned the media. When the media sees success and change, they would obviously broadcast this. This garners people's attention because they realize they can actually change something, and it is not impossible. This creates conversation amongst nationwide due to the media. It is the success of local activism that is a glimpse of light in darkness. Without this success, people see nationwide change as hopeless. When they see hope nationwide, everyone would want change, and they would start exerting pressure on the government system, right? And because the government doesn't want backlash, they would actually make change happen. So this is an analysis on why change happens on our side. However, on opposition, they never give a clear analysis on how change happens on their side. They also talked about having a network of local movements can push forward ideas in a realistic way. National movements are very hard to get to. Opposition said that we need national movements to get enough support and resources for campaign, but in reality, it is harder to connect people when the movement is so far away, meaning less support from the people and less ratio of resources. When the government sees nationwide social unrest, they are given pressure on the government. Yes, but is that pressure going to change, or is the pressure just going to shoot you down? When it's national, it is easier to justify shooting down the movement, as any opposing group can just say it's disrupting social security, right? And that is how we tackle down the opposition bench as a whole, right? So now let's talk about how we weigh over opening government, right? They gave us a lot of great points. For example, it's more effective, catering to greater goods of people. It's effectively able to create change. However, they never touched upon, they lightly skimmed upon the point of media and the main point of the debate, right? Because we live in the context. In 2020, social media and news outlets are the main way where information passes around. Updates and media coverage are crucial if change is needed. My team provides a unique aspect on the media highlighting underdogs and how this would tug on the heartstrings of locals, which causes a ripple effect. We also fill in the fact what happens after the change is caused locally by offering analysis of a ripple effect. This prolongs the effect on the government side, and this is how we weigh over opening government. So to weigh this debate as a whole, so what do we see on their best case versus our worst case, right? So what is their best case? They desperately try to put out national campaigns. However, the change is slow and gradual, and though there's conversation, there isn't much change. Doesn't get the pressure that they need to actually push forward these national policies. However, on our worst case, locally step-by-step convincing. However, because it's a smaller group, it is actually easier to cause a ripple effect. So as I end my speech, I would like to further emphasize the fact that we know that change is needed, but however, its most important, most and impactful way is to start locally and highlight the contributions made by closing government concerning the media. And this is the end of my speech, and I could not be prouder to propose. Thank you.
I think it's clear in this debate that prioritizing national activism over local activism is crucial for effectively achieving substantial change and making up for local activism's efforts left off. Not because of how big we are or the scale of these nationwide movements, but because of its more unified approach building on these smaller, gratified successes. On both sides in our world, we have national and local activism. We'd argue that local successes, though very valuable, do not automatically translate into a larger scale impact or shift the societal norms on their own. Note that we consider local activism to be an asset in smaller changes, and we on CO do not want to discredit the work that they do officially. It's just that on a larger scale, operations lead to more sound outcome. And I think that our greatest asset is the fact that national activism, which was largely disconnected from these grassroots realities, is now should be the more prioritized move. Bigger social and societal problems require this national coordination. Two things I'm going to do in my speech today. First, I'm going to do clarifications, and second, I'm going to go for responses. So two other clarifications I'm going to make before I move on. The first thing to tell you is that with local activism, you can have immediate and impactful results for specific issues like those faced by the feminist group or the LGBTQ+ community. Opening told us that national government is not equal to national change. Similarly, less people to convince does not equate to those people being impacted by that change. We see that local activism has the ability to address issues with direct and visible results within the community, but these effects are limited in the scope in which we emphasize this because they have a dominant power in that region, yes, but it's very difficult for them to move larger. When under the premise that local activism shifts to different themes or accommodates them, we don't think that local activist movements will be able to go through with this because they're not competent enough in funding. I'll take that POI by Nabin.
Okay, so just because you reach more people does not mean that you gain more support. How do your side gain more support?
Is that the end? Okay. So building on the smaller successes of local activist movements, we believe that nationwide movements gaining traction better are able to connect to government. And while this does not equal the same unilateral change, we believe that this is a better impact. And I'll expand this later on within the rebuttals. Second, people don't care or can't understand national scale movements in status quo, so they're unable to empathize with these movements. We don't really see this as the case, or rather how this case stands. There will always be people who are, of course, disinterested in the social function of society, but if concerned about not getting attention, a larger national mobilized movement group would be the most effective in tackling these issues, including gaining their traction. A larger, broader scale could mean more opportunities for such traction. Moving on to our responses, we'll be mechanizing two major questions in order to properly respond. One, what sets us apart in our setup? And two, what does this world look like? Two reframings from our side. Local movements are the stronghold and foundation of local movements. CJ presents this point to say that local activism is the basis or the foundation of the number one step for activism. We go to say that if that were to be the case, local movements are more manageable because of their smaller size, which simplifies their processes into initial activism efforts. That is more so the reason why national movements should be the ones of priority. Once they're in place, prioritizing national activism becomes the most crucial point. The final process, being the final process, being the final and bigger process of the movements is being scaled up to ensure that these changes under that foundation are already managed and better permanently implemented for such policy changes. Second, people will be able to directly know what local communities and will lead to immediate change. Opening presents this point very early on in the debate, and to be fair, we see this as one of OG's fairer points. The problem isn't that immediate change isn't being given, immediate attention or change isn't being given. It's that is where the impact stops. Under the premise that local communities fight as activists within a smaller scale, and it's not a guarantee that this logic will be met, but under the premise that it is, local communities do have the leverage to address their needs because they're not operating on too large of a scale, and so initial impacts can be faster. But further on, for activist groups, including the feminist group, this is not where they want the impact to stop. The point here is to build on this momentum and strategize on a later, broader scale to achieve the systematic change they need to impact, hence nationwide movements. But this just doesn't end up happening. A few local communities will be changing, but that doesn't serve as a better impact for the broader movement or change the way of norms. Because how does change work on our side? To answer this very big question, national activism often organizes and they unite in efforts across various regions and sectors to focus on their common goal. So nationwide campaigns like the anti-discrimination protection movements for LGBTQ plus community, they involve lobbying Congress and they organize rallies across multiple states. Seeing the angle and reaching out for an outcome appears farther away for the movement. Third, local communities cannot start or meet the logic. For groups like the feminist activists, the goal extends, of course, beyond immediate fixes to encompass wider change. Local change isn't the angle that they're facing. The momentum generated by local actions should ideally be leveraged to build a broader movement and effect reforms. Process can't be stalled there, and local successes, while valuable, do not automatically translate into this large-scale impact shift on their own. And lastly, the foundation was laid by local movements. Local activism played a crucial role in grassroots organization and laid the foundation for significant social change. However, with the world having been evolved and the scale of today's challenges often require a more broader approach. We tell you national activists can lobby for and influence these federal policies and legislation, and that they're more effective in doing this because national campaigns secure better funding and attention, and this is important because of the end goal. Large-scale products just need that similar amount of preparation in order to be competent enough to respond. Their greater incentive to pass their policies and meet the end goal of their movement is amplified because of the amount of people they possess within their groups. Another point on the unification process. With that on our side, that's why and these are the exclusive benefits on our side, and is why we win this debate, and we're very proud to pose as closing opposition.